Thank you for coming in the cold and the snow to chat about Parish. I want to know, what is it like to film in New Orleans? There's an otherworldly magical charm to the city that I don't think any other city sort of has, in my opinion. This is me being from New York City, being from Harlem.
I'd have to agree with you. This story was called The Driver originally, and it
Hmm.
was placed in the UK. And it was 3 2-hour movies
Hmm.
about a man who was a cab driver. So the driving part of it, because I am a driver and love cars, appealed to me. And so we developed it for our American audience and placed it in New Orleans because the city has that not only a charm, but it's also, to me, has a very deep spiritual presence.
Yeah.
There's a spiritual presence, and it feels also like it's a bit ghosted
Hmm.
by presences
Hmm.
of former living
Right,
beings.
right, right.
And what I loved about the city as well is has historical city that's a port city that is multidimensional but also multiracial.
Right.
And to me, the indigenous people that are there are really, if you look at them closely, they're really Indian people.
Hmm.
They're carryovers of that ancient civilization. And so there's so much there to draw from musically
Hmm.
and energetically
Right.
that we loved placing it there. And I felt like this was the story that had to be told in NOLA.
And can you talk about the logistics of filming in NOLA? I've been there once before. The streets are the way that the city is designed is very intricate. There's a lot of narrow streets. There are a lot of people. There's a lot of residences. And how do you craft or sculpt something to take place within that environment?
It's so interesting. You're so astute to observe that because the French Quarter is just a small part of the city. And when you think about Katrina and the weather events that happened in the city, you start to understand why it was built the way it is,
Hmm.
right? Because the French Quarter was the only portion of the city that didn't get destroyed during Katrina
Hmm.
because it was built that way.
Built that way, right?
And ancient way of building, and it was supposed to be the levees were made that way to protect that portion of the
Hmm.
city. So as cities build out, they become geographically they become vulnerable,
Right, right, right.
and so, but the vagaries of filming there, I mean, I had some real car stuff to do in the French Quarter downtown,
Hmm.
which you could avoid altogether, but that's why we're there, is to see that part of New Orleans.
Hmm.
There's also suburban section, and there's also other sections that feel less indigenous and more generic.
Hmm.
But I had to do scenes where I had to drive a car at 60, 80 miles an hour through those narrow streets.
Hmm.
And that can be quite dangerous because they're cobblestone and anything can happen. So you have to be
Hmm.
very, very careful. But it is a city that is so, its essence and its effervescence lend to being shot on screen.
And so much of the city is still sort of intact from when it was first built. So when you mention like driving through and over cobblestone and sort of keeping abreast of like, this is, how the way that things used to look back then, we want to preserve that while also creating something that feels lived in, that feels like something is a part of
A-
New Orleans.
Absolutely, there's a warehouse district, which was really great because
Hmm.
Gracie and Parish he is a black car driver, and he has a garage
Hmm.
to hold his cars. So in the warehouse district, who still looks old enough and antique enough to be just that, it still gave us enough space to use a space as a garage for his business. There is, of course, the French Quarter, but there's also Metairie,
Hmm.
right? You get out into the suburbs, and we have a whole part of our story that deals with not just Gracian's world, but his world collides with that of other races,
Races, right.
i.e., white supremacist kind of feeling
Hmm.
group of people who are they live in the suburbs of New Orleans. That's also interesting as well because you get a chance to see houses that are not new, but that still preserve the feeling of a 60s and 70s New Orleans.
Hmm.
Um, Music has a lot to do with our show.
Right.
It plays into our show in a great deal because we also have a very African element of our show. We have a whole African family, an African businessman
Hmm.
who's very Afrocentric, who
Right.
came from Africa and starts his business in New Orleans.
Hmm.
So that also plays into the ability to deal with the cross cultural references that our show touches upon and storyline and everything else. So Gracie's, has an interaction with this African businessman
Hmm.
and finds out things that surprise him. And so there's also New Orleans is also the place of great political. I mean, politics were very
Right.
strong in New Orleans
Hmm.
and very demonstrative in how it affects it did in the past, how it affected the national political
And there's a
scene.
lot of strong grassroots organizations that have come up out of New Orleans. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it just made me think
No,
about how there's a lot of grassroots stuff that starts there and
that's right.
spreads out.
These people in New Orleans are indigenous people who do by hand.
Hmm.
They're creative. They are able to think differently and out of the box. And again, because I mean, there's so many different elements of New Orleans. It's also the place of pirates,
Right, right, right.
right? So
That's what we'll talk next.
when you start thinking about all the different elements, like the Lafitte brothers
Hmm.
were basically owned so much of the real estate in New Orleans, but they were basically
They were. I was
pirates.
gonna say they were pirates.
They were pirates. So, it has a gang mentality
Hmm.
in New Orleans. And it depends on what gang you're from and belong to. We wanted this particular city to represent our show because a lot of our show has to do with these different um, hierarchies,
Right.
of and principles of integrity, not only in politics but also in the everyman Gracie and Parish's life.
And not only that, but how these organizations and different factions and communities coexist in a place that is, and you're in New York City and you'll see one person, you may never see them again, but the likelihood in New Orleans that people know each other is very high.
It truly is. In a way, it's a small, big city.
Hmm.
And oddly enough, you're speaking the truth. There are local characters surrounding the French Quarter that people know.
Hmm.
There's music on the streets. There's music everywhere in New Orleans,
There's a
and
food culture and there's all that.
all of that.
Hmm.
And I was astounded. We were shooting one day, and I was on my way to a location, and one of the major roads was down to one lane because they were having a parade,
Hmm.
and the parade was this happens a lot. Right, so you think Mardi Gras is one day in New Orleans,
Hmm.
but you have all these marching parades with bands that are every day of the week because of the local neighborhoods
Hmm.
all line up next to each other and they be celebrating something.
Hmm.
So they had closed the road, and there was this whole group of African American men and women who were on horseback celebrating their culture,
Hmm.
um, equestrian culture,
Hmm.
equine culture,
Hmm.
which was just fascinating to me. So I'm always surprised at New Orleans. And the other thing I love is the spiritual essence of New Orleans. There are many, many, many churches.
Hmm.
There's worship everywhere,
Hmm.
always. And that stands and coexists next to, Miss May's, which is a bar that's open 24
Hmm.
hours, right? So there's a lot of celebration that happens there surrounding alcohol, surrounding spirit. But it is a place where people are joyous, they're happy, they're soulful, and it's a wonderful backdrop for our show.
And when talking about your character and the things that they experience in the city, is there anything that shocked you while playing this character? And anything that shocked you about yourself, anything you learned about yourself? I know you've been in this industry for a long time, but learning never stops.
It never stops. I mean, this character to me is the everyman. So for me, you've never seen John Cotolo Esposito play a character like this.
Hmm.
A man who's vulnerable and struggling to keep his family together, a man who's losing his home, losing his family slowly, and losing his business.
Hmm.
So this is the first time I think you'll see someone who has to. I call Gracie and Parish an ordinary man who is searching and finding a way to become extraordinary out of the circumstance that he is that he's um, challenged with.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me personally, I learned how to have patience. I was also a producer on the show,
Mm-hmm.
and how to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
How, I played a lot of characters lately where I controlled the chaos,
Mm-hmm.
and controlling the chaos is one thing, but not knowing how to control the chaos is another.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to figure out what your life is supposed to be next
Mm-hmm.
when it's all falling apart. When things fall apart, what do you do?
What do you do? Mm-hmm.
And so the carrot is dangled for a job that seems like it's a regular gig, and it turns out to be something otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's, do I stay in this knowing that this is going to lead to a bad end?
Mm-hmm.
And so it tests your moral turpitude. And so for me, I learned even in shooting this that I have a moral turpitude. This was one of the hardest and most challenging gigs I've ever done.
Mm-hmm.
But I was determined to get from point A to point B and to tell a story of human beings that you all want to see.
If you could say three things that you hope people get out of seeing this, and what they get out of it from your character and your performance, what would you say?
I'd say courage. The courage to hope, the courage to dream, the courage to survive. I would say dedication.
Mm-hmm.
Dedicating yourself to the idea and the dream that you had. Gracie in Parish is a business owner. He wants it to survive. He knows that this is something he always had his heart in, and he wants it to be able to leave it to his children. Um, and then hope. It takes a strong person to hope against all odds when
Mm-hmm.
everything's against them, and so part of the way I felt making this was that we had weather. We had weather in New Orleans is not cooperative in the
Right.
summer. It's rain every single day. You got to shut the production
Right.
down for 2 hours. Lightning, this, that, and the other.
Right.
You know,
It's
and many
hot.
other things that
Right.
that we were challenged with allowed me to learn a lot about myself, to persevere. But finally, I'd say be true to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know when we're not being truthful.
I know I gotta go, but I have to ask this question. You've been in the industry. How do you continue to show up as your full authentic self? Having been in this for so long and having seen the changes across decades of what this industry has turned into and where it's going. How do you remain true to yourself?
I have some practices I do, which is I believe in quiet prayer and meditation. I check myself because I'm in a business where people say you're great, you're the OG, all that. Yeah, I've been around a long time, but I pride myself on not knowing, on realizing that I actually, you know, I'm a little awkward and a little uncomfortable, even though people think I'm cool. Um, you know what I mean? It's the only way for me to stay real,
Mm-hmm.
like, because I realize that much of what we do is a play of consciousness.
Mm.
Like, if I mean, right away, if you put a camera on, like cameras on us, it changes how we act.
Mm-hmm.
Because we think we got to be one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I've got to drop in and out of characters. I'm expected to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So for me to maintain my authentic self is to go, I still don't know everything,
Mm-hmm.
and so I want to practice listening and hearing. And you don't only listen with your ears, you also listen with your whole being, your
Mm-hmm.
eyes, your observation,
Mm-hmm.
but you listen with your heart and your spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I keep checking in with that, because I'm no better than anybody else. I am Gracie in Parish,
Mm-hmm.
the everyman in Parish, and I'm proud to be. That's a big part of me, and I'm so happy that you, as an audience, are going to see it soon.
Thank you so much for coming to Deadline and chatting with us. I appreciate it, and everybody needs to go out and check out Parish when it drops. And thank you so much for sharing, being vulnerable.
My pleasure.